Good morning. My name is Christina Horner, and this is my final Global Communications project. The reason why I chose my topic is because in Module 2, there was an article about Iraq and the Americans and how the Americans still have colonial control despite them leaving the country. We still have a lot of control in that area, and so this interested me in looking at more colonialism in the world. So I did some research and I was looking for what areas of the world are still under colonial control. So we call this neo-colonialism, as neo as in new. So my research question is, what are the social, cultural, political, and economic factors that maintain neo-colonialism in certain Caribbean societies? So talking about the Caribbean islands. The question is, what is neo-colonialism? Well, neo-colonialism obviously has power involved over developing countries. A largely accepted definition of neo-colonialism includes retention of military bases, exploitation of resources, preferential trade treaties, imposed unification of colonies, conditional aid, and defense treaties. The term neo-colonialism came about in the 1960s as former European colonies in Africa were gaining their independence. It describes a continuing relationship between Western and former colonies that is said to offer the Western world many of the advantages of colonial rule without many of the costs. No cost to the Western people, of course. Neo-colonialism as a concept focuses on economic relationships between wealthier and poorer countries, of course. The Caribbean being a much poorer country than the USA or the Netherlands or Europe, United Kingdom. Wealthier countries are said to use various mechanisms, political and military as well as strictly economic, to keep within their national economies as much as possible of the value added in any productive process with international components, while relegating the more laborious and less valuable parts of the productive process to poorer countries. So they are left to do all the work. More about neo-colonialism. I found this term very interesting. Political means have been used to strengthen the control of wealthy countries over poor ones. One of the best known and most controversial in the first decade of the 21st century is the use of international financial institutions, which we've talked a lot about throughout the course. Some of those being, let's see, so in the 21st century, we've used the international financial institutions like International Monetary Fund, the IMF, we talked about that one a lot, and the World Trade Organization, to force peripheral countries to grant favorable terms of trade on primary products. Another effect of International Monetary Fund mandated economic restructuring has been to sharpen class divisions in the peripheral countries by forcing governments to reduce investment in rural development and education, which is, it's important that these countries are able to further their education. So I'm talking about the Caribbean as far as neo-colonialism goes. Some of the popular islands that we hear of, we think of this tropical paradise as Americans, such as the Bahamas, Jamaica, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Cuba, U.S. and British Virgin Islands, and there's many more. There are 35 identifiable political entities in the Caribbean, and it has a population of 43 million, which is smaller than that of Colombia, just to give you an idea of the size of all the various islands. 19 of these can be regarded as colonial Caribbean countries. So 19 of these are under neo-colonialist rule. And this is in the sense that they are non-independent entities over which extra-regional powers exercise ultimate control over international law. So they don't have control. So I'll go ahead and tell you the 19, I know that's a lot of them, but the 19 countries that are under neo-colonialistic rule include Cuba, Dominican Republic, Antigua, Barbuda, if I said that right, Barbuda, the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Haiti, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and Grenadines, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. Those are the 19. That's a lot of countries that are still under colonialistic rule. I do have a map on here, but I'm not going to attempt to. It's by the Caribbean Sea. Cuba is the largest of the islands. Moving on. Okay, so neocolonialism in the Caribbean. The contemporary Caribbean is one of the most politically fragmented regions for its size on Earth, and one with the strongest remaining colonial presence. There's a 500-year history of colonial influence in the Caribbean, which was the first and earliest territory of Western overseas expansion. So it's been 500 years. This is a history of conquest, genocide, colonization, settlement, piracy, European rivalry, African slavery and the plantation system, Asian immigration through indentured servitude, constant movements of people, and imperialist military intervention. In these processes, every single ethnocultural group that occupied the Caribbean space did so on terms that acknowledged the superiority of the culture of the colonizing power, so of America or whoever that may be, and destroyed or devalued their native culture. So this practice still occurs today in the form of neocolonialism. Some characteristics of neocolonialism. Opportunities for self-improvement are structured so as to encourage cultural assimilation. So looking at cultures changing to the colonizing culture. So cultural assimilation of those in power. This implies internalizing the worldview of the colonizer. Once this is done, you do not question the existing hierarchies of power. You just go along with whatever power is in place. One of the perverse effects is that the Caribbean people's country often judge each other by resorting to constructs created by the colonizer. This happens in Haiti. The main goal of imperialism, so there's a term from our course, imperialism today is to ensure that the former imperial states still maintain economic dominance over their former colonies. This is accomplished in the form of neocolonialism. So control by external powers is exercised in a variety of ways. So looking at neocolonialism in the Caribbean, we're looking at finance. Their finances are under control. Caribbean countries have been said to be among the most highly indebted market economies in the world. Because of their weak, undiversified economies, most Caribbean countries are unable to borrow on international financial markets, or can only do so on unfavorable terms. So this includes high interest rates and those sort of things, so they can never get out of debt. They're reliant on grants and loans from official sources such as the International Monetary Fund. So there's the International Monetary Fund again. We're talking about what, in the case of the Caribbean, they shift the burden of taxes to the general population so they can reduce fiscal spending. Financial dependencies in conjunction with overall economic dependency can therefore become a source of control over a nominally independent state. So the higher powers remain in control. So talking about the International Monetary Fund again, the IMF, it's used as a tool to move in and take control of the economy of the developing countries. So for an example, Jamaica is one of the Caribbean countries. One tragic case of IMF intervention is Jamaica. After the island nation's economy crashed in the early 1970s, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, named Michael Manley, giving into pressure from the IMF and the Conservative People's National Party, came up with an initiative that included many elements of democratic socialism, as it is called, for disengagement from international capitalism, so trying to get away from the international capitalism, socializing the means of production and exchange, increasing Jamaica's self-reliance, and diversification of foreign economic relations. So Jamaica had become dependent. The Conservative People's National Party was not pleased with the idea of this democratic socialism and thus went to the IMF for aid. This was disastrous for Jamaica, using the International Monetary Fund. They were lent the money in 1977 but had to agree to pension and wage cuts and the removal of price controls. And by 1980, the economy in Jamaica was in worse condition than before the IMF loan. So just showing how they remain under control. 30% of the island's workforce was unemployed, and the foreign exchange deficit was significantly higher than in 1977. The freeze on pensions and wages were beneficial to the foreign corporations, who later moved in as they were now able to fully exploit the Jamaican people without having to worry about any minimum wage or labor laws. This was presented to the public as economic liberalization. However, it didn't help them at all, using the International Monetary Fund. Neocolonialism. So in terms of trade, the exports of most Caribbean countries are heavily skewed towards the U.S., Canada, and European Union. Although free trade agreements appear to be a good idea to the people of the Caribbean, the effect is to further strengthen the position of the U.S. and the European Union corporations in exploiting the markets, labor, and natural resources of Caribbean countries, placing local firms at a considerable disadvantage. We're also looking at military. This is another way to control the country through military means. Military cooperation agreements between the Caribbean and the United States are another link in the apparatus of neocolonial influence. In 2008 through 2013, U.S. military assistance was given to the Caribbean countries that totaled $2.2 million. This is all in an effort to further the U.S. cause and influence in a critical sector of society that often plays a pivotal role in supporting or transitioning to democratic governments. So we're looking at making everybody into a democratic government, whether they like it or not. Another very important way, since we're talking about global communication, and is the neocolonialism in the Caribbean and the media. The Caribbean is increasingly overwhelmed by newer forms of U.S. media, so the U.S. media is just pouring in, and they're seeing a lot of this. The islands are being saturated with a flood of video, cassette tapes of U.S. movies and television shows. Just like we've talked about all along in the course about JR and Dallas, these countries are well aware of who JR and Dallas are also. Computerization is coming. Satellite downlinks can pull whole U.S. stations off the air from as far away as Chicago. The situation is complicated by closest to the U.S. We are very close to these countries, geographically, economically, and politically. To use advertisers, the Caribbean represents a local market. The British-influenced Eastern Caribbean speaks English, so language is no barrier. Caribbean people recognize many American figures from TV programs, just like I was just talking about the Dallas and JR. They recognize a lot of people from the 50s, all the way back to the 50s. And American TV has been around for some time in these countries. Caribbean governments have found that heavy use of U.S. canned programs is the easiest, simplest way for local television stations to make money. So in lieu of them using their own programs and their own education and those sort of things, they use the U.S. canned programs, which are difficult to change. Thanks to cable, television is penetrating even the most remote areas in these countries, and some Caribbean islands now receive satellite programs 24 hours a day. An example of that is in Trinidad. It's still illegal. So in Trinidad, it's illegal to swear, and those laws are still in the books. However, the videos and the satellite and all of that, the movies that they're receiving do not follow these rules. How about culture? Imported goods, media, and products threatens the culture and promotes a consumer lifestyle at the expense of the community values. I wanted to refer to, so in our last module, we looked at an article called International Communication Shifting Paradigms, Theories and Foci of Interest. I wanted to refer to a couple of theories because this reminded me of what's happening with the neocolonialism in the Caribbean. The neocolonialism and neo-imperialism, so there's another term that is taking place in the Caribbean, reminds me of the dependency theory for several reasons. So the dependency theory. It emphasizes global structures and interrelationships that influence third world development and postulates that post-independence dynamics keep third world countries locked in former colonial power structures. So this is all a dependency theory, but it completely sounds like what's happening in the 19 countries in the Caribbean. The world should be analyzed in terms of a center, comprising mainly Western countries such as the USA and Western Europe. And the periphery, we use that word a lot through the course too, the periphery, which encompasses the poor countries of the world, such as those from Africa who have recently emerged from colonialism but remain dependent in various ways on the rich Western countries. Countries on the periphery, for example, come to depend on Western developed technology and investment in the demand for media products. Television programs in particular necessitates large imports from center countries. Another theory I thought was interesting was the modernization paradigm. And it's based on the premise that as nations emerge from colonialism, there would be a natural development of the previously colonized countries along the same route or stages followed by Western countries. And I think we see that in these countries because we've been there for so long that they follow along with the same things that the Western countries are doing at this point. The developed Western societies consequently served as models for the less developed societies to strive for. Structural theory of imperialism can also apply, and I have been using the term imperialism throughout this presentation. So I primarily use the United States as an example of neocolonialist power. However, there are several other countries who are involved in Caribbean affairs, such as France, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom. So United States and influence on the Caribbean. To most people in the Caribbean, the power and influence of the United States is an ever-present fact of existence. It's just we've been there for a long time. It's a fact. The hundreds of thousands of tourists who flock to the islands each year from the United States is a big part of it. And it's a staple of Caribbean economies. Many Caribbeans are also bound up with U.S. through a network of family ties. So one of the Barbadian families has a family member or close relative in North America. One of 4 Barbadian families has a family member or close relative in North America. Others move north for employment opportunities and to join their families. Many people in the Caribbean have an interest in understanding the U.S. and their main source of information is news and entertainment received from U.S. cable, broadcast television, and video cassettes. The U.S. lifestyles, values, and attitudes that pour off the television sets into the Caribbean homes infuse viewers from a form of propaganda that is all the more effective for being subtle. So, is it time the Caribbean nations take control? The progress that has been made has resulted from efforts of Caribbean people themselves and are continuing. Rebellion, revolution, cultural affirmation, and other forms of resistance are as integral to the Caribbean experience as are exploitation by external forces and internal elites. The tradition of struggle serves to inspire, inform, and motivate current generations. Slowly but surely, a pan-Caribbean consciousness is emerging, led by the vision of cultural practitioners and containing the seeds of a future Caribbean nation. And this concludes my global communications presentation. Once again, we're looking at neocolonialism in the Caribbean. Thank you.